Hello, Mike.
Hello, Mohit. Good evening. Or good evening to you.
Good evening. We're back. We're back online. Thank you for being here, Mike. It's our journey is so fantastic. It's beautiful. Let me just check how many friends we've got here. Oh man, it's flooded. It's quite a few people. Great. Good evening, Subhash. Good evening. Great to see you. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, Amanda, Rohan, Brian, Betty, Srinivas, Kees. Oh, nice to see you, Kees. I hope you're okay. Nawal, fantastic. Gary, Steve, wow, Brian. So it's Mike, it's windy in Booster.
It's windy everywhere.
Brian said, yeah, it's a little warm here today. And there's the first day I'm not wearing woolens really, but there are mosquitoes, and well, that's part of life, that's in there.
This afternoon was the first day for a long time when I've had to put the fan on.
Yeah. Oh, you put the fan on. Fantastic. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our little world of birdie webinars. And Mike is here again to unfold his magic, all his fantastic goodies that he's going to distribute again today to you. Fantastic. So look, friends, I've got a bit of glitch in my internet, so I'm going to quickly introduce Mike and myself and then go offline because I don't want this to fall flat right now. So here I go. So Mike, I'm going to introduce you again to those people who don't know you already. So about Mike. Ever since his childhood in England, Mike has been fascinated with watching birds and recording and documenting bird sightings. Mike lived in Delhi in the year 2002. He was a very active member of Delhi Bird Club and contributed to the Atlas of Birds of Delhi and Haryana. After he moved to Bangalore, he soon got interested in exploring sites that weren't visited so frequently. He worked for Bird Count India to help promote Indian birding and especially high-quality data recording. He's an eBird reviewer for India. His interest in bird recording and migration led to a short-term assignment of running the BTO's Bird Track program. Fantastic, Mike. I'm going to just quickly talk about myself. I am Mohit Aggarwal. I'm blessed with 4 children, a son and a daughter, and 2 non-humans. One is a Labrador, and the other one is an escapee African grey. I'm a follower of Shiva, and today's Mahashivratri, so I'm very excited. Professionally, I'm an experiential ecotourism specialist with deep love for nature. I help people travel to some wonderful places in Asia. I'm the founder of Asian Adventure, the 26-year-old travel company. It is the largest and #1 bird watching tour company in India. The company is on a large mission to help Asian elephants with the corridors, free the Himalayas of plastic waste, and help small wildlife NGOs and save the ancient Himalayan shrines. So we've been making some baby steps towards conservation, and they've been very, very successful. Tomorrow we've got a group of 20 PhD students visiting Pangot and figuring out what is the future of that area. My interest is to promote ecotourism in its true essence and convert every tourist to an ecotourist. So that was about me. Mike, a quick one. Over to you before this net goes off.
Certainly. Well, I hope you can stay with us if you can, but otherwise we'll catch you later. So welcome, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And we'll get started because, once again, we have a lot to get through. Okay, so this week off to the Andaman Islands. We'll see that. So the Andaman Islands is in the northeastern Indian Ocean. So it's part of the Union Territory of India, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the 2 main island groups. And it's very famous in India for the fantastic beaches. It's probably India's prime beach destination, aside from Goa, where we went to last week, of course, and fantastic marine life generally. And let me know, I've lost my next button on the presentation, so bear with me a moment. Okay, There we are. Okay, you can see where exactly we mean by the Andaman Islands. Here, the Andaman Islands, you can see actually not really that close to India. We're closer to Thailand, and when you look at the Nicobar Islands, we're actually just off the northern coast of Sumatra. It's the closest landmass there. In fact, the southernmost tip of India is part of the Nicobar Islands. So obviously the bird life is quite different to the rest of India. So we don't need a permit if you're Indian. If you're a foreigner, you need permits to get to the Andamans, and you can't actually visit all islands. So as we'll see, we can visit the main birding islands, but a lot of the islands are actually off limits. And this just shows you the Andaman, the various different islands, or the main islands. In the northern half of that map is the Andamans, and you can see you have North Andaman, Middle Andaman, and South Andaman are the main ones there. Port Blair being the capital, where we will fly into, or even boat into, if we do it that way. And the southern half of that map, which is actually a lot further away than it's shown there, are the Nicobar Islands. And this is typical Andaman habitat. This is Corbin's Cove, which is a popular beach very close to Port Blair. Can be quite crowded, but you still find birds along here as well. This is a popular tourist site. They have another beach. Wandor Beach is on the west side, and this is a really nice beach, and it's the gateway to the Mahatma Gandhi Marine National Park, which is a fantastic area of coral reefs. Very good for turtles as well. You can snorkel, you can scuba dive, you can take boats out to some of the islands. You can take glass bottom boats to have a look at the coral. And some of the coral reefs around here are really spectacular. Turtles, this is a young leatherback turtle. There's 4 species of turtles that you can find on the Andamans. So the leatherback, which is this one, which is the commonest one, I think. Hawksbill turtle, green sea turtle, and olive ridley turtle are the 4 you can see, with a bit of luck. Some of the other islands we have here, this is on one of the different main islands. This is on Havelock Island, which is again a popular touristy one. This is Radhanagar Beach, which actually in 2004 it was Time magazine gave this the title of the best beach in Asia, and the 7th best beach in the whole world. So worth a visit, although a little bit more for tourists than birds in this particular one. But you can see from the habitat around that it's very forested. So you have these beaches, you have these superb evergreen forests around as well. And some of the islands are a bit like this. So this is Barren Island, quite well named, although it is still forested, some of it. This is the only active volcano in South Asia. So the Andamans and Nicobars are on a sort of underwater mountain range that runs all the way through Indonesia, as far as even Papua New Guinea, that sort of area. And this is the only active volcano in that chain. It erupted 3 or 4 years ago, was the last time it erupted. So Barren Island, also the seas around here are one of the most famous scuba diving areas in the world, in fact. And you can get dive ships that go out to this fairly remote island, which is also not too far from Narcondam Island, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the Andamanese and Nicobarese are a tribal population originally, hunter-gatherers. It's interesting actually that in the Andamans, the Andamanese tribes are believed to have come from Africa, and the Nicobarese tribes have come from the east, from sort of Burma, the Malay Peninsula, that sort of area. They originally had very little contact with outsiders, partly because of the remoteness of the islands, but also because they tended to be quite hostile. And if you were shipwrecked here, you would probably get killed by the tribes. So in the mid-19th century, a lot of the tribes retreated into some of the more remoter areas, following battles with the British, who occupied at that time. So some tribes have become a little bit more integrated, but there's still several others that are quite remote and quite hostile. So there's a couple of known tribes. The Jarawa are one of them, which actually means hostile ones in South and Middle Andaman. And there was controversy a few years ago in the Andamans when a major road was built through their forest areas. And that led to more contact with them. It led to disease spreading through the population. And it's still, although the heron area is off limits, it's still actually visited on illegal tours where buses go out taking tourists to try and see the tribe and the tribes and take photos of the tribe. And the tribe, some of the people have been started begging from tourists. So that's all illegal, hopefully stopping now. Another of the tribes you have probably heard of is the Sentinelese, which is this one in this picture here, on North Sentinel Island. And they are in complete isolation. There's probably maybe a couple of hundred people there. And over the years, the Indian government has sent various expeditions of anthropologists to try and make contact, usually met with extreme hostility. So, for example, when the tsunami, which we'll talk about in a little while, hit in 2004, they sent helicopters to go and check on the tribes, and the helicopters were attacked by arrows. In 2006, there were two fishermen who were illegally fishing quite close to here, and they were shot and killed by archers. And so following some attempts to make contact, the government policy is that we leave them completely alone and no one makes any contact now. However, what you probably have heard of wherever you are in the world was a couple of years ago, an American, John Allen Chow, an American missionary, decided on his own that he was going to reach the Sentinelese to preach Christianity to them. So he, on a very well prepared mission, but he illegally went and visited the island. He paid local fishermen to take him close. He then kayaked on his own to the shore, and he made 2 or 3 attempts to reach them and talk to them and give them gifts. But he was shot once and got back to his boat, shot by an arrow, and he tried again, landed the next day, and was then, not surprisingly, shot and killed by the Sentinelese, and then who buried him on the beach. So that was in all global news. I expect most of you heard of that one. So the Sentinelese are completely off limits. So what the Andamans well known for? Scuba diving. Scuba diving is fantastic. The marine life generally. So there's lots of places where you can dive if you have diving accreditation, or you can come on a course to learn. It's quite clear water. It's quite warm water, and there's a very high level of biodiversity. So lots of corals, since we're into identifying things, you can practice identifying the more than 500 species of corals around the Andamans, if you like. But there are quite a lot of threats to the coral reefs around. So rising sea temperatures have caused major bleaching of corals. And obviously in the tourist area, there's quite a lot of development happening. There's fishing which can be uncontrolled. And also the tsunami destroyed a lot of the coral. But these are some of the views you get underwater. This is a green sea turtle. And if you're not up for scuba diving, you can always try some snorkeling out, and it really is fantastic. So even if you're there on a quick birding trip, it's well worth doing some snorkeling. I remember when I was there the first time, and I raced around trying to see all the endemic birds, but then decided that I really should do some snorkeling, and did a half day's snorkeling. But we were still watching birds there because you have white-bellied seagulls flying over you while you're swimming. So great place. What else can you expect to see? Several species of dolphins and other marine mammals, other cetaceans. These are spinner dolphins, which are pretty spectacular because they leap quite high out of the water and then roll over several times before they hit the water again, in quite large groups as well. So it's one of the commoner dolphins there. And if you're really, really lucky, you can find a dugong. So dugong is a sea cow, as they're sometimes called. Quite large but docile marine animals, and they are totally vegetarian. They graze on seagrass in the meadows of seagrasses in fairly shallow waters. And they're majorly threatened now because as the habitat changes, as there's development along the coasts, there's been pollution from industrial areas, the seagrass meadows have shrunk, and that directly affects the dugong population. But if you spend some effort and you're out scuba diving especially, there is a chance of seeing dugong in the Andamans. And a few other things worth doing if you have some time. One of the main sites in Port Blair is this cellular jail. This is the old British jail where we put lots of political prisoners and then subjected them to various barbaric treatments. It's the cellular jail because it was almost all individual small cells, and most people were held in solitary confinement. There's about 700 cells there. And apparently over about 100 years of use, we imprisoned about 80,000 prisoners, probably a lot of whom actually died. In the evening, it's worth going to see, because you can get a sound and light show of the history of the cellular jail. What else we've got is various places. There's the Japanese bunkers from the Second World War. So the Japanese invaded and occupied the Andamans through much of the Second World War. It was a pretty brutal occupation. I think there was about 2,000 Indians were supposedly killed by the Japanese in this time. So you can find quite a few of the bunkers still around. Forest Museum is actually run by the Forest Department. It's in an old sawmill. Obviously, there was lots of timber work going on here. It's the largest and oldest sawmill in Asia. So one of the other sites on Baratang Island. This is between Middle and South Andamans, so not very far from Port Blair. There's these quite impressive limestone caves and mud volcanoes. And if you fancy a bit of shopping, Aberdeen Bazaar is the place to go in Port Blair. There's a tourism festival which happens every year in January. So it's a cultural festival, so there's lots of music and dance and sports and food, of course. Took me a while to get around to food this week, but unsurprisingly, the Andamans is extremely good for seafood, fish and seafood. All extremely fresh. Their local cuisine is very much fish dependent, but it's also influenced a bit by Burmese, Thai, and other parts of India. So Bengal, for example, being relatively close. So this is a nice tandoori pomfret. You can find some good lobster if you like. There seems to be a nice lobster chili. And one of the Bengali dishes, machur jhol, which is a sort of a spicy fish stew. Anyway, this one map you can't see very clearly, I'm sure, but it was partly to show this is North, Middle and South Andaman, and the marked places on it are our main birding sites, which are all really on South Andaman. And that's partly because of the ease of access, but also because the endemic birds can all be found on South Andaman. So you don't really have a lot of traveling particularly. There are, I didn't mention it earlier, there are 20 endemics to be found on the Andaman Islands. There's actually 29 if you include the Nicobars as well. So there's 20 endemics on the Andamans. A few of those are found on the Nicobars. There's 8 that are exclusive to the Nicobars. There's one that's on Narcondam Island. We'll talk about that in a bit. And there's also one as yet undescribed species, which we'll also come to a little bit later. And so typically for birding, we might do a 5-day trip, which is generally enough to see all the endemics. 2 or 3 of them are a bit tricky to find, but we do have quite a lot, 100% success quite often. But it's definitely worth staying for a few extra days so you can enjoy some of the rest of what the Andamans has to offer. Main birding sites, a place called Chiria Tapu, which literally means bird isle. This is on the south of South Andaman. It's a nice place to stay for a couple of days, although you can do everything from Port Blair. But it's nice to stay here to minimise travel a bit, but also because it's a good site for owls, all of which are nocturnal here. But this is a nice beach area and forest patch. This is Chiria Tapu. Mount Harriet National Park then is the largest forest area where pretty much all the endemics can be found here. So this is always worth 1 or 2 visits. And this is a sort of view from Mount Harriet. And Sipigat is probably the most well-known wetland area. The habitat has changed drastically since the tsunami, which engulfed the whole area, destroyed most of the trees in the area. And so a lot was destroyed, but now the paddy fields around have sort of become wetlands, and it's an extremely good area for a lot of species generally, including this one, the Andaman teal, where it's actually relatively common endemic on most wetlands, so on coastal wetlands and more inland. It used to be a subspecies of Sunda teal from Indonesia. Wondor, which I showed briefly early on, which is again nice forest, access to the marine national park. There's plenty of good birds to be found around there. Kalatang is another mostly inland forest area, but we're far from water, so mangrove habitats as well. And this is very close to Port Blair, so a particularly easy site to do. And the habitat looks a bit different trekking through the thick forest here. Shoal Bay is another big wetland. You take a ferry to reach this area, but not too far from Port Blair. Again, fantastic selection of wetland birds, but also, as so many places are, you've got patches of forest which have a lot of the endemic forest birds as well. And some pretty fantastic beaches again with the forest on there surrounding. I know the other main islands, this has all been on South Andaman, we talked about. Havelock Island, which has now been renamed Swaraj Dweep, which is Freedom Island, in remembrance of Subhas Chandra Bose as one of the Indian revolutionary during the Second World War. So this is where the best beach in Asia is, as I mentioned. It's has several birds, including several of the endemics, but it's also a very popular place for tourism. So it's a nice place to relax after more serious birding. One of the beaches on Havelock. And nearby Neil Island, now known as Shahid Dweep, which means Martyrs Island. That is a little bit quieter, pretty peaceful, great place to relax. Also probably one of the better places to have a chance of seeing dugong. So another good place to do 2 or 3 days after your birding and see whether you can catch a dugong. This is part of Neil Island. Anyway, about time I had some birds, really, isn't it? So I thought we'd start with some owls. So the Andamans is great for owls. There's several endemic species. They are pretty much all nocturnal, not very easy to see during the day, but with a bit of luck, all can be seen. So this is Andaman hawk owl, very much like a brown hawk owl, but they've got this sort of white patch on the face just above the bill, and it's quite white streaked below. So brown hawk owl itself doesn't occur on the Andamans, although it does on Nicobars, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And Hume's hawk owl, it's a larger, dark, very dark hawk owl. It's another endemic. The really nice Andaman Scops owl, very small and really neat patterning below and quite orangey in colour. So it's a Scops owl, but it has a very indiscreet ear tufts, sort of floppy ear tufts, not very easy to see. Not common, but usually manage to find it. Commoner is this next Scops owl. This is Oriental Scops owl, which obviously is quite widespread, but this is the Andaman subspecies, known as Walden's Scops owl, and it is sometimes split, so in which case it's then another endemic Scops owl. And this one's common, it's quite easy to see. Probably the most tricky of the owls is Andaman masked owl, which you can see is very like a barn owl. It's a very dark barn owl. used to be quite reliably seen at the cellular jail, in fact. I'm not sure it is there now, so not an easy one. Andaman nightjar is quite common, so once you're doing the owls, try for the nightjar as well. Grey nightjar also probably occurs, but rarely on the Andaman, so this is the only regular nightjar. And then swiftlets. So this is plume-toed swiftlet, sometimes known as white-bellied swiftlet, what was part of the glossy swiftlet complex before it was split. And there's one other swiftlet which you have on the Andamans, which is edible nest swiftlet. So these in particular are cave dwellers, and they're adapted to this because they use echolocation, unlike the plume-toed swiftlet, which doesn't. But edible nest swiftlets use echolocation, and you can actually hear their clicks, the noise they make. This is actually audible to the human ear. So the nests for edible nest swiftlet are almost entirely made of saliva. So different swiftlets across Southeast Asia use different amounts of vegetation and saliva. But edible nest swiftlet, which is almost entirely saliva, is the one that's very sought after for taking the nests, predominantly for bird nest soup, but also as an aphrodisiac. So across Southeast Asia, therefore, there's been a lot of nest poaching going on, and that has been a very big problem in the Andamans as well. There's been quite a lot of research into it over the years, led by the late Dr. Ravi Shankaran, and he sort of first uncovered the huge scale of the problem of nest poaching. And since then, there's been various projects that he sort of set up to protect them, to use poachers to do nest protection, to look at artificial nest sites and more sustainable harvesting. And unfortunately, I think a lot of these projects really haven't been that successful for multiple reasons, including bureaucracy. So they're common, but they're highly threatened. Then raptors, white-bellied seagull is very common. This is the one you can see while you're snorkeling. An immature bird here, but it's pretty common throughout. And actually, the Andaman is probably one of the best places to see black barza. I've seen these in the middle of Port Blair, but again, it's a spectacular raptor that you can see reasonably easily. Pied harrier is quite scarce here. The place is a little bit easier, but does occur in winter. And then moving on to some specialities a little bit. So this is a crested serpent eagle, but this one is an Andaman only subspecies, Davisoni. It's a bit smaller than regular crested serpent eagles. And when you're around the Andamans, you look at your serpent eagles fairly carefully because, okay, this is an endemic subspecies, which is rather good to see, but really the one you want to see is Andaman serpent eagle. And this is endemic. It's smaller again, so quite small serpent eagle, and very dark brown with spots underneath, so really nice, distinctive raptor. So this is an endemic raptor. Not endemic, but regular in the winter and not really seen anywhere else in India is Chinese sparrowhawk, particularly common in the Nicobars, where it's more common than the endemic Nicobar sparrowhawk. But a quite distinctive one. You can see if this is an adult, it has the really nice plain sort of rufous breast and the cere, the bare skin around the bill. It's got quite a swollen orangey patch above the bill. Japanese sparrowhawk, which is a similar status in that it's not really found anywhere else in India, but it is quite rare here anyway. It's a highly migratory species further east in Asia. So through Thailand, for example, migrates in very large flocks. So it's not really surprising it does occur here, but it is scarce. And speaking of scarce birds, the Andamans does tend to turn up some real rarities for India, which is not surprising considering its location. This is grey-faced buzzard, which is not an Indian bird, even though its Latin name is Indicus, Butaster indicus. There are 3 records in India, and I think 2 of those are from Narcondam Island and one's from the Nicobars. So it's not been recorded elsewhere, not on the Indian mainland. Andaman kukul is common, also known as brown kukul, another endemic. And also fairly common here and a resident, this is violet cuckoo, tiny cuckoo, really stunning colours. It's resident here. You can find it in parts of northeast India and other parts of the Himalayas, but as a summer visitor in the Andamans, it seems to be resident. Square-tailed drongo cuckoo, very easily confused across India with fork-tailed drongo cuckoo. Fork-tailed is more peninsular India. Square-tailed is the one you get in the Himalayas and further east. And this one shows the tail quite nicely. Actually, it's sort of square-ended, but the outer tail feathers are quite rounded rather than pointed, and there's not much of a fork. But quite a tough ID and therefore a bit of a confused status. These birds, what their distribution is, but square-tailed drongo occurs here. And we have a few species of pigeons. A green imperial pigeon has an Andaman subspecies again. Andamanica is this one. It's a fairly small compared to the green imperial pigeons on the mainland. And it's supposed to be a bit white around the face, although I can't see that from this particular image. But watching pigeons is an important thing to do if you're birding in the Andamans, because you have, well, an easy one in terms of what it looks like, the Andaman green pigeon. Obviously fairly distinctive. This is a male with that brown shoulder patch. So this is the only green pigeon there, but the one bird that can be easily confused with green imperial pigeon, especially in flight, and if you don't see them very well, is Andaman wood pigeon. And I think this is probably on the Andamans the most difficult endemic to see. It occurs in various places, but not common. It's quite secretive, as most of the pigeons are in this part of the world. And quite often, if you miss one of the endemics, it'll be Andaman wood pigeon. Andaman cuckoo dove. It's quite smart, a really bright rufous cuckoo dove, the only cuckoo dove that occurs here. Another endemic, obviously. And a bird that occurs much in plenty of other places. We covered it last week when we were in Goa, but it tends to be easier to see here, slaty-breasted rail in many of the mangrove wetlands. Same family, but different habitat. Andaman crake, again, one of the tougher endemics, not because it's rare, it's probably fairly common, but it's difficult to see because of typical crake habits. But it's a forest crake as well, so it's not really in the open wetlands. It tends to be in quite dense forest. Another Andaman's rarity, or India rarity, in fact, white-browed crake, common around Southeast Asia, but there's been 2 records in India, one of which was a bird that wintered a couple of years ago, I think, in Sipigat. And waders. So beach thickney is a really impressive large wader. It's a bit similar to great thickney that you see on some of the rivers elsewhere in India. Because on sandy beaches, most islands have beach thickneys, but it's not common anywhere. As you'd expect from habitat like this, there's a lot of waders. So grey-headed lapwing is one of the winterers, fairly common. Pacific golden plover is quite common. So a lot of these species, these are mostly winter visitors, but quite a lot of waders do over summer here. So Pacific golden plover is one of those which sometimes decide not to make their very long journey to northern and eastern Russia. So you can find a few in the summer. Grey plover is actually, or black-bellied plover, is fairly scarce in the Andamans. And we covered these last week in Goa as well, with also a nice picture of the two together. So greater and lesser sand plover, both fairly common, and a nice image showing the difference very clearly on this greater, different head shape. The larger, more angular head is very obvious here. much paler legs and a longer leg too. So easy when you see them like this. However, not very easy is this one. So this photo actually was given to me as a pintail snipe. So pintail snipe and swinhose snipe are known to be pretty much unidentifiable in the field. So various studies have been done looking at the specimens, looking in more detail, but any feature that's quoted is unreliable and overlap. So they really cannot be identified in the field. Hence the name swintail, which gets used a bit. So in India, interestingly, looking at the Andamans, there are lots of records of pintail snipe, fairly common bird in the Andamans. And there seem to be no records of swinhose snipe. Well, in actual fact, swinhose is a more easterly bird generally. There's plenty of specimens from India, so it's quite possible that most or many of the records of pintail are actually swinhose. So really, they should all be down as swintails until anyone can find a dead one, and the only way to be sure, I think. Turnstone, ruddy turnstones, fairly common winter visitor around here. Broad-billed sandpiper is always a nice one to see. Really nicely see the shape of the bill in this one, broad base and then the kink near the tip. And redneck stint, so another difficult one to identify. Thankfully this one isn't, a lovely orange throat and upper breast here. The stints are probably a bit difficult to know the exact status. Rednecked is probably quite regular here. Little might be very rare actually in the Andamans, but most people come birding here in the winter when stints are tough to ID. Not so many people still here in sort of April, May, when you might be getting nice summer plumage birds like this one. But probably rednecked is by far the commoner. Also fairly regular is long-toed stint. Certainly the best place in India to see long-toed stint. Nice long neck, long yellow legs. And terns are clearly quite common in this sort of area as well. There are several different species. There's a group of not sure which ones resting on one of the rocks, but one special one to look out for here is black-naped tern. It breeds here, but is actually present all year round. And there's a few good seabirds potentially you could see here, but these are vagrants anyway. Brown noddy has a few records. A stunning white-tailed tropic bird, also very, very few records. Unfortunately, it seems that much of the Indian Ocean is actually not great for seabirds generally. If you're really keen, you can get to the Andamans by taking a boat from Chennai. I'm not sure how many days it takes, but I do remember reading a few years ago from someone who did that as a birder, and I think saw nothing on the entire journey for 2 or 3 days. So we're not stacked with seabirds here, but there are some nice ones to look out for every now and then. So Pacific reef egret, so the only place this is regular in India. So the dark phase, they're coming both dark and light morphs. Can't see it very clearly here, but they're surprisingly short-legged, so they have a slightly odd shape. And only really discovered in the last few years is Chinese egret, which seems to be a scarce winter visitor, but it's probably been overlooked. And this one's not too difficult to identify either. A lovely breeding plumage Chinese pond heron. Again, very rare in India, probably, but in non-breeding plumage, when most of people are visiting and most people are birding in India, they're almost impossible to identify from Indian pond heron, which also occurs on the Andamans. And both of them seem to be common, but it's only really when they come into breeding plumage that can be sure of the ID. So this is a nice Chinese pond heron. And just to add some extra confusion, this bird in breeding plumage is actually a Javan pond heron. There are only 2 records in India, both from the Andamans, and both are birds like this in breeding plumage, because at other times of the year, you're really not going to be able to identify these amongst Indian and Chinese pond herons here. No problems with identifying these, though. Black-capped kingfisher is fairly common kingfisher. And a nice common resident one is collared kingfisher, we talked about last week when we were covering Goa. So it's a different subspecies you get here in the Andamans, and it is pretty commonly seen. Also fairly regular, ruddy kingfisher. I think he's resident here. I think it's some visitor to parts of the northeast India, but I think it's resident in the Andamans. And then some of the other endemics. So we have an endemic woodpecker, Andaman woodpecker, which is a large woodpecker, much like the white-bellied woodpecker of typically of the Western Ghats. And the only small woodpecker you have here is a freckle-breasted woodpecker, also known as spot-breasted. It was very similar to the fulvous-breasted that some of you may have seen in the Himalayas, which is what it used to be considered a subspecies of. Vernal hanging parrots are common. And we have an endemic parakeet. This is a long-tailed parakeet, quite a smart bird, very common. You can't miss these. Hooded pitter is probably just a spring passage bird, I think. This sort of time of year, a chance of seeing hooded pitter. Another of the common endemics is white-breasted wood swallow. Ashy wood swallow doesn't occur here. Sorry, not endemic, but is very common throughout the Andamans. Minivets. So ashy minivet is fairly regular in the Andamans, not very easy to see elsewhere in India. This one is extremely similar. This is swinhose minivet or brown rumped minivet, which have started to be seen in the last few years in a few places in India. Very difficult to be sure of the ID of these. This is Andaman cuckoo shrike. Used to be considered a subspecies of the Southeast Asian bar-bellied cuckoo shrike, but it's now split as a separate species. Quite tricky to see again, this one actually. It's not too uncommon, but spend a lot of the time very high up in the trees. And this smart bird is a pied triller, found in the Nicobars, but recent years it's been discovered in the Andamans, in Little Andaman Island in particular, which you can visit. It's off South Andaman. You can do a several hours boat trip to go down to Little Andaman and stay a night or two. So some of the endemics there as well. But pied triller has been seen there several times recently. And not a triller, but a whistler. So mangrove whistler is resident in mangroves. Quite difficult to see, but it's fairly common, and it's can be quite tame. So they're difficult, I think, just because they live in slightly awkward to access habitat. Black-naped oriole. So Andaman drongo is an endemic, quite common. Often get these in small flocks. But it can be confused if you don't see the rackets with the racket-tailed drongo. So greater racket-tailed drongo, the Andaman subspecies, which this one is, has very little tuft on the head. So it's fairly similar to Andaman drongo from that point of view, less like the greater racket-tailed you get in mainland India. So paradise flycatchers. A few years ago, Asian paradise flycatcher was split, and we have multiple species. So Indian paradise flycatcher is the one we commonly see through most of India. But in the northeast, it tends to be Blythe's paradise flycatcher, and this is probably the regular one on the Andamans. But you also have Amur paradise flycatcher, which has a few records. So I think these probably, again, status isn't very clear. There are a few records of Amur, but females and immature males can be tricky to identify. So not sure anyone's really worked out the status of these yet. Andaman tree pie, very nice endemic, small tree pie compared to rufous and grey and the other tree pies you get in India, and can occur in quite big flocks as well sometimes, 10, 20, 30 birds, that sort of thing. And some warblers to make life a little bit more difficult. This is oriental reed warbler. Seems to be quite regular in winter in the Andamans, but not really seen elsewhere in India. A little bit in the northeast, but we also have clamorous reed warbler on the Andamans, so status gets a little bit unclear with difficult identifications. Black-browed reed warbler, really strong, striking head pattern. It's fairly regular in the winter. Pallas's grasshopper, though, is scarce or overlooked anyway. I think it's going to be very common in Thailand and parts of Thailand, so it probably is commoner here. A bush warbler, we have pale-footed bush warbler. It is really quite striking pale legs and strong bill. Again, very, very few records, whether it's a vagrant or not really sure. And then philosopher warblers, equally confusing. So this is an Arctic warbler, very, very long, thin supercilium you can see on this bird. So Arctic warbler seems to be scarce, but maybe the more regular of some of the wintering Philoscopus warblers. There aren't very many records of, for example, two-barred warbler or two-barred greenish warbler. Very few records, but there are quite a lot of records of greenish warbler from the Andamans, and may well be that this has been overlooked, and several of the greenish are actually two-barred greenish, which is obviously much commoner further east in Asia. And pale-legged leaf warbler, which is actually fairly striking for a Philoscopus warbler. Again, they're really pale legs and a strong head pattern. Very few records. It seems to be a vagrant, but may well be overlooked. Asian glossy starling. This is something that almost, well, it's common on the Andamans. Very rarely seen anywhere else in India. I think parts of sort of southern Assam things get them, but you get big flocks of glossy starlings here. And if you're birding in, well, I think this is probably a Southeast Asian tip generally, but it's always worth looking at flocks of starlings carefully, flocks of starlings or miners, because rare starlings and miners tend to join up with flocks. So I do this carefully around Bangalore, but they're all common in jungle. I never find anything interesting. But there are some good ones in the Andamans. So there's white-headed starling, which is the very common endemic. This is around everywhere. But if you check these a little bit more carefully, you might find Dorian starling. This is a scarce winter visitor probably, but may be found in flocks of other starlings. And then if you're really lucky, this chestnut-cheeked starling just has two records in India. One is from here, and one is from somewhere else in the northeast. And I think it was in the Andamans one was in a flock of Dorian starlings. Eyebrow thrush is a scarce but fairly regular winter visitor. And another of the fairly common endemics is Andaman bulbul, found in the foresty areas. Andaman shama, again, another nice endemic. And another vagrant again, not a bird that's commonly seen in India at all, Siberian blue robin. There's been one or two records in the Andamans, and records from Narcondam Island, I know. And yellow-rumped flycatcher, which is an odd one in India. It's a vagrant with, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 records across South India, and one Andaman record as well. Andaman flowerpecker is the only flowerpecker on the Andamans, an endemic again. And the smart olive-backed sunbird. This is resident, but there's several different subspecies. So I think on several different islands. Certainly Andamans has subspecies, Narcondam has subspecies, Nicobar has multiple subspecies. And it's not, it's a bird that's quite common further east in Asia as well with other subspecies, but it's not been very well described in India or studied. So there's a possibility that olive-backed sunbird could actually be more than one species. Red-throated pipit is a strange status in India. It's a rare bird in India, not very many records anywhere. The Andamans is the best place to see it, except bizarrely for one lake near Bangalore, which seems to have them almost every winter, but rarely seen anywhere else in India. And the wagtails, eastern yellow wagtail. So another bird that needs looking at, or preferably listening to a little bit more carefully. The Andamans has many more records of western yellow wagtails than eastern yellow wagtails, but that's probably not right. It's probably more eastern yellows than western yellows. This one, I assume, is a very grey one, but so are some westerns, but you really have to know the call to be sure of them. But it's probably a common bird in the Andamans. As is forest wagtail, a common winterer, actually a long-distance migrant, migrates to Northeast Asia in the summer. And yellow-browed bunting. This is the only Indian record from the Andamans, and a couple of years ago. So there's a lot of potential, especially if you're going in slightly out of time. If you go in migration times, most people probably tend to visit December, January, February. The weather is quite humid in the Andamans, so that's the most pleasant time, but I can imagine September, October could turn up some really fantastic birds if you wanted to find something interesting. But it's not all birds and not all marine wildlife. There's a few good butterflies. There's, I think, endemic Andaman clubtail and Andaman Mormon. Leopard lacewing is quite spectacular. It's a northeast Indian bird, only very butterfly, sorry, only very recently discovered on the Andamans. And orange emigrant had the first Indian records recently from Great Nicobar Island. So I've been mentioning Narcondam Island a couple of times. So Narcondam is remote. It's a small volcanic island in actually India's easternmost island. It's a nice diving destination. It's not easy to access. It's quite distant. It takes a fairly long boat trip, and you need permissions to get there. But remarkably, considering it's, I think, less than 7 square kilometers, it has an endemic hornbill, Narcondam Hornbill. That is Narcondam Island, so it's actually a lovely forest and a quite small island. It's a dormant volcano, and it has one really spectacular hornbill that doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. So on Narcondam, it's fairly common. There's probably a few hundred birds, but clearly it's a threatened bird in such a restricted area. There's been various development proposals for Narcondam, though the habitat loss over time as settlements or navy settlements and police outposts and things have been set up. It's obviously at risk from tsunami destroying a lot of the forest sometime, but pretty spectacular. So not very easy to see because you need special permissions. I mentioned it's a popular dive area, so dive boats go out and stay for a few days or overnight in this area. And because it's fairly common, you can usually see it from the boat. So if you're really keen, a keen world lister, and you want to get all the endemics, to do a say 2-day boat trip out to Narcondam from Port Blair and not get off the boat, but have a good chance of seeing Narcondam hornbills in the treetops is quite possible. And I thought we'd finish by having a look at the Nicobar Islands. So the Nicobars are very seldom visited. There's a few more bird watchers, mostly Indian bird watchers, who've been able to go in the last few years. And as we saw from the map early on, the Nicobars are actually quite far off from the Andamans, more than 500 kilometers from Port Blair, and much closer to Sumatra. So again, bird life is quite different. Not very easy to get there. There is a boat, a scheduled boat, which takes 2 days, 1 night, but often takes 4 days. So it's not a very guaranteed trip. You have to have several days buffer for your trip. You can take a helicopter, but it's very expensive. So not an easy place to visit. You also need special permissions to visit the Great Nicobar Biosphere Reserve. Almost the whole of Great Nicobar Island is a reserve. But anyway, it does have, as we mentioned before, 8 endemics on the Nicobars. And we'll have a look at them. So the Nicobars was the worst affected by the tsunami. So, and described it in detail earlier, but 2004 was when the huge tsunami off the coast of Sumatra hit. It was an earthquake that was 9.1 on the Richter scale. So it was the 3rd largest ever earthquake worldwide. It was under the sea, the epicenter. So there was an enormous death toll overall. More than 200,000 people died, but it probably would have been a lot less had it hit somewhere else or it land. But that created the massive tsunamis. So the Nicobars were hit disastrously, particularly Great Nicobar, which is the southernmost island. Waves were apparently 30 meters high. The mangroves were almost completely destroyed. And I know that surveys that were done post the tsunami reckon there was 97% of the mangroves were lost completely. So it was pretty devastating. Most of the tree cover lost. It's been not all negative, because I think there's regrowth is happening. Mangroves will take over. They've discovered a few new species of mangroves in the now sort of quite barren areas, but it was really a disastrous occurrence. This is Car Nicobar. This is more north in the Nicobar Islands. Another smaller Nicobar Islands, Teresa. And so the birds, one of the most desired endemics, Nicobar megapode. So megapodes, for those of you who don't know, are unique in the bird world in that they don't raise their own young. They don't raise don't hatch their own eggs. They lay their eggs in a mound, sometimes up to 1 meter high, a mound of vegetation that keeps the warmth in. And the parents play no part at all in raising the young. So the eggs hatch, and the young are self-sufficient from the moment they hatch. Now, Nicobar megapode population was decimated with the tsunami. So it was known that most of the megapodes in Nicobars are within about 100 meters of the coast. So it's thought that at least 70% of megapodes were killed in the tsunami. So they're really highly threatened now. But the other endemics we have here, Nicobar imperial pigeon, fairly similar to the green imperial pigeon we looked at earlier. You also have, not endemic, but the spectacular pied imperial pigeon. Another serpent eagle, this time Nicobar serpent eagle, which is a really small pale serpent eagle. Nicobar sparrowhawk. Another scops owl here, Nicobar scops owl. This one's quite interesting. We had a couple of hawk owls earlier. This is a Nicobar subspecies, isolata, of brown hawk owl, probably, but it's sometimes been considered a subspecies of Andaman hawk owl. If it's a brown hawk owl, then this is the only place brown hawk owl occurs in the Andaman and the Nicobars. Nicobar parakeet, endemic. Nicobar bulbul. Out of all these endemics, this is the only one that doesn't occur on Great Nicobar Island. It occurs in the central Nicobars. So this means if you are doing a trip to the Nicobars and you manage to get permissions, they'll probably only be for Great Nicobar, and chances of seeing Nicobar bulbul, therefore, are very slim. Nicobar jungle flycatcher is the final endemic. And not an endemic, but a spectacular bird, and another Nicobar bird, Nicobar pigeon, which occurs throughout Southeast Asia to Papua New Guinea. And it's nomadic, so it's known to fly quite long distances over the sea. I don't know whether the Nicobar birds are fully resident or whether they move or not. And if you do get to go to the Nicobars, particularly you get down to the very southern end of Nicobars, you definitely have to look out for this. So this is what's been tentatively called Great Nicobar crake. It was discovered in 2011 in surveys post-tsunami. There were a couple of sightings then. It's quite distinct from Andaman crake and from some of the other Southeast Asian crakes. Seems to be an undescribed species, but I've not actually heard very much about it since that original discovery in 2011. There have been sightings. I haven't seen other photos, but not a lot is known, and it still hasn't been properly described. So maybe that's something that you might be able to do if you manage to get a trip to the Nicobars. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, Mike.
And I've got a special thanks to Salil this time for managing to get photos of every single endemic we had on Andaman and Nicobars.
Absolutely. And there are these photographers like Shakti and Guru Raj and Jenny and Sadeshna. All these people have worked so hard on acquiring these photos. They've been explorers in the true sense. They should be applauded. They should be given awards by Royal Geographical Society or something like that, because they're the ones who just going out in the field and finding a whole lot of these species and photographing them, and it needs that sort of perseverance to be there. It's
incredible what good photos we have of these birds now. I know a few years ago when I think it was the BNHS were publishing threatened birds of India, and they were looking for photos. And I got approached because I had a really poor picture of Andaman cuckoo shrike, and it was the only picture they could find anywhere. So my dreadful picture has been published somewhere because at the time it was the only one. So it's nice that we now had a choice of good photos, so I didn't have to use any of mine this time.
Yes, almost 20 years ago when I went with Goran to Andamans, that was the time there were researchers working in Chidiya Tapu. And they were working that time on the crake, and we got some good photos of the crake, and we were doing night birding, and we got the owls and things like that. But that time what they did had the calls, and we were playing the calls as well at that point of time. And there were people with great photography equipment which I had never seen before. I'd never seen those lenses in my life and things like that. So there was, but now I think we've come of age. We've managed to, these photographers, I have huge respect for wildlife photographers who are unconditionally giving information, their stock out for webinars like this so that they can sensitize people and educate people. I think it's a great contribution to conservation. Hats off to them. Thank you very much, photographers, for contributing this to this.
Another big change in the Andamans, I think, from when I went there in 2006, I think was when I was there. is that you now have a couple of very good resident guides. So when I've shown quite a few rare birds from the Andamans here. Well, they might not actually be that rare because, I mean, now we've got resident guides who are out there birding and taking photos and finding some really good birds.
Yes.
So that's another thing. So for things like the owls, they're great because they know where you can find them without disturbing them.
People like Shakti and all people, they're doing a fantastic job. They're keeping an eye on all these things happening in places like Tiglipur and Rangit, and these are far-flung places where I've been, and it can take a day or maybe a couple of days to get to these islands, and you'd find some species there, and so they're keeping a tab on all these things and they're recording them well. So absolutely brilliant.
And I'm sure there's plenty of discoveries to be made. I mean, as I was going through this, I was checking the status of some of these species, and you go into some of the warblers and thinking, well, is this one rare? Is it not? Are there many records or not? Is this one confused? There's so much scope for finding some interesting new birds and finding things to be commoner than you thought or that have been overlooked as well.
Absolutely. So I think, Mike, while you're going to be here in India for a bit, would you like to do a tour to the hills in May and June or April, May? Probably ask people to join us for one of your tours this summer.
There's a couple of things. It's difficult to know what the international situation is like, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we can open up for some foreign visitors to maybe reach in June or July and head up to Ladakh or something like that. It would be brilliant that time of year. But April, May, unfortunately, is still going to be too early, I think, for most people from abroad. But we'll do domestic trips, certainly. So I think parts of Uttarakhand, I think, are worth exploring in April, May, getting up a little bit higher and catching a lot of the summer visitors that have arrived. So, let's we'll see if we can announce some dates for something fairly soon.
And Mike, the next webinar that we're planning is for Kashmir and Ladakh. A bit of Kashmir and more of Ladakh. So that's going to happen on the 18th. And Farina just posted a link for people to register for this as well. And, if they register, we know that, they're going to get their replay links just in case if they miss and all of that. So absolutely brilliant. I know some people, it's past our closing time, so some people have already left or they might be wanting to leave, but that's fine. Those who are here will, friends, if you want any of those replay links from the earlier webinars, you want any of the trip reports, just go ahead and send us an email and we'd be happy to share all of that. I've shared a link here which says Bobo Birding / Birding in India webinar series, and that's got the repository of all the information that has happened so far in the last couple of months.
Yeah, we must have 9 or 10 of these now, I think, haven't we?
Yeah, I've lost count.
The big advantage with
things like that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was saying the big advantage of watching the recordings is that you can then fast forward the boring bits.
Correct, absolutely, yeah. Or keep focusing on the food and other things as well if you see it go along.
Yeah.
I'm so mesmerized with your talks, Mike. It's just that when you put them together, when it becomes all compact and presentable, then what you get is there's millions of those thoughts and those glimpses and all those experiences that you've gone through, and you just want to go back to these places. So I think it's great, Brian. So thank you for coming here.
I'll pick up on a couple of the questions that were there, and it's sure. Steve asked a pity the Nicobars are so difficult to access, and yes, it is. I think it's. I mean, quite a lot of people have been in recent years, so it's become a lot easier. The biggest problem, especially with anyone coming from abroad, is that the transport is unreliable. So, as I mentioned, the boat takes 2 days, except sometimes it takes 4. So, if you've got a flight to catch back, it's a bit tricky. But it's something that, when travel opens up a little bit more, we're working to try some exploratory one. And if you can leave a few days at the end of your trip flexible, hopefully we'll manage it because it's a super, must be a super place. I've obviously not been at all yet. One other question Deepak was asking about, are these islands part of the Central Asia flyway? Those migrate here from other eastern countries. There'd be less the Central Asian flyway here, it'd be more the East Asia, Australasia flyway. So especially a lot of the waders, but also a lot of these warblers and things. The waders especially, going down through wetlands in Eastern Asia. But so a lot of these birds then are coming from Northeast Asia, so parts of Russia, parts of China. A lot of the small birds, warblers and things that are wintering are coming from those parts of Eastern Asia. Yeah, so there's and undoubtedly because birders don't really go to the Andamans at perfect migration time, nor we go in the winter. I'm sure we'll be some interesting migration.
Fantastic. Great, Mike. I think you've answered the questions. If anybody has any more questions, please go ahead and put it in chat, and Mike will answer.
Certainly, or as email afterwards if you want to talk about. If you have any more questions or want to talk about any potential trips anywhere?
I think, Mike, we'll put a trip together, and then we will offer that trip in the next webinar, which is on the 18th, and we will plan 1 or 2 trips together. So, people will have the choice to go for any of these as you go along.
It will be great.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Thank you, friends. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. It was really, really heartening to see all of you, and I hope you all enjoyed. I'm sure you did. So stay tuned for the next one and be in touch. Love you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you in Ladakh next week.
Yes. Thanks, Mike. Thank you. Thank you.